name some of the 19th century women you thought about. Ella Knowles. And Ella Knowles, as you may know, Ella Knowles Haskell was the first female lawyer in Montana. Greeno. She was a rodeo star, yeah. Evelyn Cameron, great 19th century photographer in eastern Montana. Elizabeth Barker. Tell me who Elizabeth Barker is. First female superintendent of schools in the state of Montana. Dr. Atwater. And she was, and Jeanette Rankin. And Mariah Dean. So a bunch of medical people we have over here. And I'm repeating these so that everyone can hear. So that's why. Susie Yellowtail. A registered nurse. So a bunch in healthcare. Sarepta Sanders and Martha Rolfe Edgerton. And those were Martha Rolfe Edgerton. In my mind, I think of her as the wife of the territorial governor. And Sarepta Sanders is Wilbur Fisk Sanders' wife. But she was also an activist. What? Daughter. But wasn't she also a suffrage activist, I think? Yeah. And I don't know about Martha Edgerton. What? What? The daughter. Uh-huh. Nancy Russell, Charlie Russell's wife and business manager, really much more important as a business manager than I think people give her credit for a lot of times. Kirby told me recently that there was some amazing quote. What was what about her as business manager?
Grace Stone Coates said that Nancy Russell was the kind of person that felt like she had to help God run the world.
Betty Babcock, I heard, who I think we know often as the wife of Governor Babcock, but also a member of the Constitutional Convention, and really the reason that we have our 1972 Constitution, because she went around the state and she really sold it to a lot of people who were on the fence, and it passed by a really close vote. And the restoration of the Capitol. And Dorothy Eck, another Constitutional Convention delegate, really active in the League of Women Voters, which is one of my favorite Montana women's groups. Dorothy Bradley, yet another one of those con people. And
Belle Weinstein.
Oh, Belle Weinstein. Do people know who Belle Weinstein is? She's a suffrage activist. She worked for Jeanette Rankin when Jeanette Rankin was in Congress. She wrote a great article for the magazine called Mother Was Shocked about how shocked her mother was when she was going around, when she was campaigning for suffrage and speaking outside of saloons and on the street. And Frida Fliegelman is her sister, who was a linguist and a poet, and they both grew up in Helena to a prominent Jewish merchant family. Nada-Wista Culbertson. She was a Blackfeet woman who married a fur trader and was really important in helping him to cement the bonds with her people. And again, a lot of these women in the fur trade, these Indian women who married non-Indian men, were really important in helping in that trade as being intermediaries for the trade. Who? Mary Kastner, mother of Belt. Yeah, so she's a good one. She's an interesting person in that she was a business owner. She owned a hotel. African-American woman. Was she born into slavery? I think so.
Married to John Kastner, the big coal mine owner there in Belt.
And much beloved in Belt. So it's you guys have done so much better than any other audience. You should give yourself a round of applause. And I'll tell you what, everyone should write their name on them and they should pass them to the right, and we'll pick 2 people to get prizes. I brought 2 prizes. We have Girl from the Gulches, the story of Mary Ronan, who no one mentioned. Oh, you got Mary Ronan on your list? Okay. And so while you're writing your name and passing them over to to Kirby, I'll just tell you, if you want a prize. Anyway, she was a really interesting woman. She came up with her father, who was a miner, teamster, And she grew up in Bannock and Virginia City. And Helena tells great stories about Helena. And then she married Peter Hernan. And the other one is I Do, a cultural history of Montana weddings, which has as many men in it as it does women. But so it's really thrilling to me that you know, I've talked to teachers at MEA. I've talked to museum professionals at the Museum Association of Montana. I talked to librarians at the Montana Library. State Library had a workshop, their fall workshop. And really, even collectively, they could only come up with, you know, maybe 2 people for the 19th century, and then maybe 2 people for the 20th century. And then finally someone would say, well, my grandmother. And they'd be kind of joking. And I was like, yes, your grandmother. You know, because really your grandmother does count as a woman in history. One of the things that we're hoping that this project does is make us think, or make people think, you know, well, first of all, like, I want everyone to be able to name 20 people by 2015. You know, you'll sit down and I'll say, who are Montana women in history? And you'll just be able to whip off a list, right? But I also am hoping that the project is going to help shift people's kind of vision of what history is. I think the reason that we started with politicians, you know, and then we went to doctors, is we had this idea that historically important people are politicians and maybe doctors, you know, or in the military. And really, history, I would say, is about lived experience. It's about the people who shape the state. It's about the people who are here and are interacting with these greater historical forces. So your grandmother who homesteaded, or your aunt who used ration coupons during World War II to feed her family, are historical figures, you know. Your grandmother who was in the women's club that helped found the library is a historical figure. So all of these ordinary people making a difference in their communities, responding to larger events, figuring out, you know, individual agency, but also interacting with these big forces, you know, of the Great Depression or of the war. That's what history is about. To me, that's what makes history really interesting. And I think if we think about history in that way, all of a sudden, it's very easy to include women. I think one of the reasons when you're coming up through school, you don't hear about very many women in textbooks. You know, you have Sacagawea and you have Jeanette Rankin maybe, you know, if you're in Montana. But it's because we have this very top-down view of what history is. But when we start changing that up, then all of a sudden there's room for lots and lots of people, including women. And so one of the things I'm hoping is that through this year we can start thinking about history a little differently than a lot of people do. You know, the other thing that I'm surprised I didn't hear, I did hear the superintendent of schools, but you know, when we think of types in Western history, women, you know, we think of school marms and we think of prostitutes, right? I mean, that's kind of, no one said Big Dorothy in this group. I've never had a group that hasn't said Big Dorothy, you know. Oh, you had Big Dorothy on your list, there you go, you know. So those are these kind of tropes. We have prostitutes, we have school marms, and maybe we have Westering women who were dragged out here by their husbands who hated the prairie or something. You know, I mean, that's kind of the stereotype of the, I guess, Ma in Little House on the Prairie, you know, brave and noble. So again, my goal is generally to just expand our view of what history is and who the women are. And so I wanted to just walk you through quickly some of the things when I think about women's history. What do I think about? Well, the first thing I think about is housework. You know, so who knows what these are? A potato masher and a pot scrubber. No one's ever been able to get both of those either. You guys are smarter than the average audience. That's exactly what they are. And housework, you know, has traditionally been women's work. And thinking about how it's changed, who's responsible for doing it, and you know, and how that's changed over time. That's history. And also thinking it's worth stopping and thinking a little bit about how important it was. Jewel Peterson gave a great interview. She's from Cut Bank, and she gave a great interview about her homesteading parents. They homesteaded outside of Cut Bank, and she said, well, theirs wasn't a marriage of love. She said, I hardly knew anyone who got married for love. She said, you got married because you needed someone to work with you. She said, a man just couldn't be out working in the fields all day and then come in and start the beans boiling. It just didn't work. And you realize that washing clothes was almost a 2-day operation. In the wintertime, you melted the snow first before you even ever started. And that was a day and a half. So it was a really difficult thing for a man to be a bachelor alone. And I think, come on in. Yeah. I think one of the great kind of frauds that's been perpetrated on us is this idea that housework isn't work, and this idea that domestic labor, I think we have always undervalued domestic labor, which actually is still incredibly valuable. I found this 2012 article in a survey of current business that provided these fascinating estimates of the value of household production in the United States from 1965 to 2010. And the new estimates of the value of unpaid domestic work, and they said represent a conservative lower bound, yet they are by no means low. Inclusion rates in the level of GDP is 39% in 1965 and 25.7% in 2010. So if domestic labor were counted in our gross domestic product, then that's the percentage it would be, 39% in 65 and 25% in 2010. And we don't think about that. It's just, it's free, right? And it's partly free because women have done it. But it wasn't really free because it took these women out of employment. And we're going to see, especially on the frontier, and as I flip through, you'll see some, Montana had early on a disparity between male and female male and female residents on the mining frontier. The men came out to mine, and they didn't have a lot of women that came with them necessarily. And they had to buy all the things that wives give people for free. So they had to buy someone to wash their clothes. They had to pay, they had to pay a laundress. They had to buy meals at a boarding house. They had to, buy someone to clean their boarding house. And it's a huge amount of money, right? And it's one of the reasons that Montana was really good for women was because it was a place that you could put your traditional female skills to work and make money. So work is another thing, wage work, selling of labor. So free labor and selling of labor are two things I think of when I think of women's history. You have traditional workers in traditional female professions, like being a telephone operator, heavily female profession, and then less traditional ones, like this 1940s picture from Copper Commando, which I love that picture. I just think it's just too funny. So wage work and how that's changed. And then people mention professionals. I think if Dr. Carolyn McGill came up, but she was a doctor that practiced in Butte, and Alma Jacobs was in a more traditional female profession in that librarianship is a traditionally female profession. And she was the director of the state library. Before that, she was the director of the Great Falls Public Library. And she also founded Humanities Montana. She was one of the founders of that. So tremendous contribution. So professional women have always been with us in Montana. And like I said, business owners. Owning your own business was a really good way to get around hiring discrimination. I was looking in the newspaper today, the 1892 Helena Independent, not today's newspaper. And of course I saw the columns that said, I was looking at the want ads, and it was wanted female and wanted male. And so the female ads were there was one female cook, they said wanted a woman cook, and there was 2 cleaning women. And then the men had a much greater range. They wanted a male cook, they wanted a male blacksmith, they wanted a male teamster, but the opportunities were much bigger for men, and the wages were different too. How many people remember when you had newspaper columns, when you would look for a job in the newspaper and you had wanted male, wanted female? Yeah, Yeah, it's not that long ago. I mean, this is, and I think that's the other thing that I hope that people walk away from as they start thinking about women's history, is how much has changed and how much we take for granted. It's kind of, things have changed so radically. And I'm not saying that everything is, pie in the sky, equality, there's still a wage disparity of about 77 cents a woman makes to a man. But the amount of things that have changed is really remarkable, and it's hard even to remember a day when that's different, especially if you didn't live through it. So those are always, to me. But owning your own business was something that women could do when they couldn't get hired by a man. And you had a lot of women business owners. And often, like I said, using traditional female skills like cooking and cleaning to run boarding houses, to run restaurants, to run bakeries, to own hotels. The other thing that owning your own business did was if you were, you didn't work out if you had children. And so it was a way for widows or divorced women with children to make a living. The women, when I think of women's history, I think of charity work also. Our society is really built on this idea that you have this whole pool, not of free labor, not just to provide for men's and women's and kids, families, domestic needs. We don't count that as part of our GDP. But we also have this whole world that's built up around free labor to support our communities. So these were examples of charity workers during the Great Depression. But churches, every church was ever built was built on chicken dinners, ice cream, and strawberry festivals put on by the Ladies' Aid, right? I mean, that's where churches still, that whole body of work to support the church is female. And other kind of social institutions too, like hospitals. Many of our hospitals in Montana were founded by religious women, either Catholic sisters, like the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, or in Miles City, the Presentation Sisters founded Holy Rosary, or by the deaconesses, which was the Methodist. The Methodists got worried that the Catholic religions were taking over schools and hospitals, and they needed to have an in there, so they set up a deaconess system so that the Methodists also, and they set up whole large numbers of institutions, hospitals. I think Benefice out of Great Falls is a deaconess. The one in Forsyth, the Forsyth Rosebud County Hospital, was founded by deaconesses. So they have a whole network of hospitals also, and also schools and orphanages by these religious women. And like I said, libraries. Librarianship is a typically female profession, but a historian also looked just at the founding of libraries, and she found that about 75% of libraries in the United States were founded by women, by women's organizations. So what you would have, and this one I think is the Red Lodge County Library, I'm almost positive it's Red Lodge. Okay, good. Okay, that is Red Lodge. And in Red Lodge and in other parts of Montana, the Women's Club got together and decided they wanted a library. They organized it. They collected books by subscription, or they got people to donate books. They found a place, whether it was in the city hall or in Miles City. I think it started in a hat shop, someone's millinery store. She put over a corner, and they grew it. And then they would get the city to take it on, and they would convince the city council to write to Carnegie, in this case, for a free library. But that push for it, and the first libraries were usually founded by women. And a lot of this activity was done by club women. That's a picture there of the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. The club women movement was hugely important in organizing things like libraries, parks, places for children to play, also looking at issues like clean water, making sure, lobbying to make sure that you had good filtration so that you weren't getting disease carried through the water. All of these infrastructure things that we take for granted were really pushed through, a lot of them, and worked very hard on by women as volunteers through their women's clubs. And some of the women, so club women was one level of activism, but then you had women that kind of took it another step further. And I love these women activists. So Elouise Cobell is a great 20th century activist in kind of the modern mold. Does everyone know who Elouise Cobell was? Yeah, she's a Blackfeet banker who realized that the Department of the Interior was didn't have good accounting systems for individual accounts, individual accounts, and she sued the federal government, and she sued the Department of Interior, and it was an incredibly tough battle, and she won ultimately, and she got the Department of Interior to change their accounting system. Some of the activists are Sister Providentia Tolan was a nun who worked up on Hill 57 outside of Great Falls with landless Chippewa Cree and worked very hard. She had the ear of people like Mansfield and Metcalf, worked very hard to against termination of tribes, against relocation, and to get services to a very poor population in Great Falls. She was just tireless in her solicitation of the community for food and clothing, and she set up schools, classes so children could get educated. She's really a pretty amazing person. And then Hazel Hunkins is the third person, and people know who Hazel Hunkins is? She's, some? Yeah, she was mentioned in the paper. Yeah, she's cool. So she went to Billings High School, graduated from high school in Billings, went off to college, got her degree in chemistry, came back because her mother was sick, and couldn't find a job as a chemist. She applied all over, and they kept on saying, oh, you're very qualified, but we don't hire women. And that made her really mad. And that's what changed her life. She became a feminist activist. She went back to Washington, D.C. after women had the right to vote in Montana. So women in Montana get the vote in 1914, but nationally, women still don't have the right to vote in every state until 1920. She joined Alice Paul's Women's Party. She was among the pickets in front of the White House during World War I. So she becomes a real radical activist. And all the time she's writing back to her mom as she's getting arrested in front of the White House. Don't worry, Mom, I'm really okay. So her mother wasn't totally thrilled by her actions either, but she's writing home saying, it's perfectly safe. Prison isn't that bad. So she ends up also then being involved in the equal rights fight, pushing for equal rights amendment. She gets married and moves to England, becomes a feminist activist in England for a lot of years, and then comes back in the 70s to push for the ERA amendment here again. So, and all her start in Billings. And then you have the women who go from being activists to go on to being politicians. We always think of Jeanette Rankin, but Maggie Smith Hathaway traveled as many miles for suffrage as Jeanette Rankin did. She traveled all over the state campaigning. And she and Emma Ingalls were the first women elected to the state legislature. Hathaway was a Democrat and Ingalls was a Republican, I think. But they were from different parties. Ingalls was from the Flathead, and Hathaway was from Ravalli County. And Ingalls was a newspaper woman, too. She and her husband ran a newspaper. When he died, she continued the newspaper, and she was said to have a caustic pen. Dolly Akers was the first Indiana woman elected to the state legislature, also an early female tribal council member from Fort Belknap. And of course, the 1972 Constitutional Convention delegates, a lot of you remember, that's where we got our wealth of 20th century names, I think, is from these women of the Con-Con. There were 19 out of 100 delegates. 19 of them were women. That was really unprecedented kind of mass. And it was because they passed a law that said that anyone who was already holding elected office couldn't run for the Constitution. It was supposed to be a citizen constitution, and that opened the way for women. The other thing that opened the way for women is that they had frankly been studying the issues that the Constitutional Convention was going to take up for years. So because the League of Women Voters was very active in good government. And the League of Women Voters also was one of the few groups that actually had citizen lobbyists at the Capitol before 1972. And what you might not know is before our new Constitution guarantees us open government, there was lots of closed meetings. When hearings were going to be scheduled wasn't posted. So League women were there all the time. You couldn't just say, oh, I want to testify on this bill, and I know it's going to be on Wednesday at 10 o'clock, so I'll make a trip to Helena to go testify Wednesday at 10 o'clock, because they didn't post it, and it could be changed all around. So the League women were there, and they were tracking down and votes weren't recorded. No one was recording votes. And so that wasn't public either. So the League women were sitting in the gallery. They were writing down how everyone voted so that that information could be known. They were there all the time so that if a hearing was up on a bill that they were interested in, they had someone there. And they realized that this system was really corrupt. It was very easy for the Anaconda Company to control a lot of what was going on if no one knew how you voted. It wasn't recorded anywhere, just win-loss, And if no one could go to hearings and testify except for paid lobbyists. So they pushed very early and very hard for a new constitution. And they had done a lot of preparatory work. So then when it came to run to be a Constitutional Convention delegate, these League women were really knowledgeable. And a lot of them got elected. And one of the stories I've heard that I'd love to get confirmed sometime is a few of them roomed together too. And they had lots of dinners at their house, potlucks, or other League women coming, other delegates, particularly the other members of the League of Women Voters, they'd all get together at this one house for dinner every night, and they talk strategy about how they were going to get things done the next day. So they had their own. They worked hard not to be seen as a voting bloc. They didn't want to be accused of being underhanded, but they coordinated very well together to shape the final document. And then, of course, Betty Babcock, who was not part of that, League group, but was a really strong Republican voice and was able to go out with a Democrat and an independent and travel around the state and convince people that this was a good thing to have the Constitution reformed. So, but it's not all politics and it's not all work. Some of it's fun, right? And I think one of the things that we should think about when we think about women's history is athletics and how much that's changed. So let me ask the women in the audience, how many played half-court basketball? How many have not heard of half-court basketball? Okay, there's some young people who've never heard of this. So I don't really know. So the idea was that women were less physically capable of having stamina than men, and so they only played on half a court. And there were special rules. You had to pass. You could take 3 steps. You could only dribble 3 times before you had to pass, so the women weren't running too hard, right? So it's a really different game, right? How many here have been to a girls' sporting event in the last 2 years? Okay. How many of you, like 15 years ago, would ever have imagined you would be going to a girls' sporting event? Couple, right? Yeah. Some of you are too young to know. If you think about kids coming up today, how many went to college on a sports scholarship? No one, right? And that shows our age. I think if the audience here were in their 20s, you would have a lot more people who, oh yeah, I got a scholarship for swimming or volleyball or basketball. Title IX really transformed our world in a way that we don't think about. Absolutely, the young people coming up have no idea. But I also would like to point out, it's not this progressive march. I think people think that history is sort of like this steady march to progress without any effort involved. And in fact, Fannie Sperry Steele wrote events in rodeo that women are not allowed to ride today. So it's not just that women have the right to do something because the clouds shine down and then they keep it forever because, the sun is shining or whatever. The way that the world is shaped by what people want and what people work for, right? So it's not the steady march. But athletics is a really interesting way to look at history, I think.
Martha, just a comment, if I may too. In Montana and probably in other parts of the country, it changed in the 40s and 50s. Before that, in Montana, there were girls' basketball teams,
Well, so
and they played. I mean, they were strong, powerful teams, and then there was nothing.
So according to Julie, in the earlier days, there were strong women teams. Then in the 50s, that goes away, and then and the 60s, and then it starts coming back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Now, I was really excited to find this picture of the Havre women's football team, and I was like, 1924 women's football, what? And then I did a little research, and I'm sorry to say I still love the picture, but they only played one game. It was, they couldn't find any competition. So they look great. They seem like they have a real coach. It doesn't seem like the powder puff football of today's era. It doesn't seem fake, but in fact, they weren't tremendously competitive. They only played one game, and only in 1924, and then that was the end of the women's football team. Again, when we think about women's history and history generally, I think we need to think about women and as creators of beauty, both kind of formal artwork, like the Depression era WPA mural that Elizabeth Lockery is painting in the Dillon Post Office, but also everyday beauty. Has often been a woman's job. Quilts, home decor, flower arrangements, gardens, beadwork, the things that bring, clothing, fashion, sewing things. The things that bring kind of beauty and grace into our everyday lives are often created by women and often not thought that much about, taken for granted a lot of times. So that's another kind of set of women's tasks that we should be paying attention to. And of course, in every war, women have, since women have served as nurses. We have a wonderful World War I nursing uniform in our collection that'll be up on the blog when we, get to that point. And then in World War II, they had more formal avenues for service. And one of these pictures, so this is Minnie Spotted Wolf, is the one on the far left with two other women. And she was Blackfeet. She grew up by Hart Butte. And she became kind of the poster child. She was the first woman to join the Marines, and first Indian woman. And she had a comic book kind of made after her. And she said, compared to the work she did at home, it wasn't that hard. Because she was a ranch girl, she had driven truck, and she became a truck driver, and she's a tiny little woman, but she changed these big tires, and she was tough. And then for women who weren't actually serving in the military, all of that home front duty, from victory gardens to scrap drives to ration, feeding people on rations, all of that war bond, raising money for war bonds, morale, USO work. So women in war has always been a topic that, again, often overlooked. It's not, when we think of war, we don't often think first of women. Women have helped tell the history and record the history of our state. Here we have Julia Toole and Evelyn Cameron as frontier photographers, but writers. Martha Plassman was a journalist that did a lot of chronicling of kind of how things used to be. And then our great authors like Grace Stone Coates, the poet, and Mildred Walker, who kind of recorded our stories. You know, one of the jobs that women have often had in families is this preserver of tradition and preserver of family connections. So typically, how many of you live in a family where the men are in charge of writing the Christmas cards? 1, 2, okay, we got 2, 3 men at it. Right, how many of you live in a family where the women are in charge of writing the Christmas cards? Okay, so that keeping connection with family is traditionally women's work. Passing down traditions and heritage is traditionally women's work. A lot of that happens through food. So the daughters of Norway, you know, you have the sons of Norway, but it's the daughters of Norway who are cooking the lefse and maybe the lutefisk, I guess, if they, you know, so that preserving and maintaining tradition and passing down cultural heritage to children is often female, but not exclusively. And none of this is exclusively women's work, but it's often women's work. And at the same time, women were great embracers of modernity. Not all girls wanted to learn how to make lefse, you know, and not all of them wanted to have their hair long and to sit at their mother's knee and be, you know, I just love these flapper girls, you know. They're out for a good time. And that's another part of women's stories. I mean, I think sometimes we tend to glamorize women as somehow, you know, I don't know, the angel of the hearth or something. And I bet their mothers were tearing their hair out. So. Someone mentioned not Elouise Cobell, but that cultural intermediaries, especially in the fur trade era, was really, truly a woman's job. Incredibly important, the intermarriages and the connections that it gave to the woman's family for goods and access to good trading partners, and for the trader to access to people to trade with. So that was a really important job. Homesteading is a woman's story as well as a man's story. They estimate about 18% of homesteaders were solo women. So unmarried or widowed or divorced. About 18%. And one of our big immigration, you know, among the different immigrants that came, you know, we tend to think of people coming from Norway and Germany, and they all did. But Canada is also a foreign country, and people also immigrated down from Canada. And during the Homestead era, a lot of women emigrated down from Canada just over the border, because in Canada, you couldn't take out a homestead as a single woman. You could in Montana, you know. So all you had to do. And so the ways that your own personal life and options interact with the legal system in these larger structures is really interesting. So you have single women homesteaders like the Anna Shirley, who came out, and a lot of the times you'd homestead in a family group. So she was by her brothers and sister and mother. They all had homesteads nearby one another, and they all helped each other out. You know, occasionally you'd come down by yourself, but usually, you know, if you had a choice, it'd be nice to be with landsmen, you know, people from the same country, the same area, or family to provide assistance. And then you had women and girls growing up on the homestead. All of a sudden, you go from a male frontier in the 1860s, in the mining frontier, the homesteading frontier in the 1910s is a family frontier, you know, and it's filled with families, it's filled with women, and it's filled with children. Really shifts the whole demographic nature of Montana. And it's part of the reason that in 1914, I think anyway, women do end up getting the vote. That vote passed strongly in eastern Montana, in the homestead counties. Not here. You know, it lost in Lewis and Clark County. It lost in Silver Bow County by just a slim margin, because the unions worked hard for it, but it still lost. It lost in Deer Lodge County, in Anaconda. So it lost in those traditional mining counties. It won big in the homestead counties. And that's partly, yeah.
What's the population of eastern Montana?
You know, that's a good question, and I can find out. But what I can tell you is, you look out at eastern Montana now, and you drive for miles, and it doesn't look like there's anyone there. But you're driving along 12, and you see Venanda. Has anyone been to Venanda? Venanda is, you're driving along, it's the middle of absolutely nowhere, and Venanda's a ghost town. There's nothing there except for a 2-story brick school. And all I can think of is how many kids had to be settled all around there to fill that school. They were there. And then it dries up in 1918 and everyone leaves, you know. Well, not everyone. But there really was this huge influx of people who were there.
28 counties in Montana have fewer population than before World War I.
Okay, did you hear that? 28 counties in Montana have fewer people now than they did before World War I. So, yeah, so it's a different, so it's hard again. That's another place where it's hard to put our heads back and to imagine how different the world once was. Okay, and of course, we have our school moms and our prostitutes. They do go together. You know, and I put them together because, like I said, they are sort of the stereotype. When people do think of women in history, they think of school marms and they think of prostitutes. I don't think they think quite so much about how hard both of those groups of women worked and under what miserable conditions, really, they both of those groups of women worked. But they really were, both of them, tough jobs. I'll just, if you haven't read When the Meadowlark Sings by Nedra Sterry, it's one of my favorite reminiscences. She writes about growing up, and her mom was a school teacher. Her dad was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and he would go out on threshing crews. He'd go off, he'd come back and get her mom pregnant again, and then he'd leave again. I mean, that was sort of, he wasn't around much, but he was around enough to give her mom 6 kids. And her mom had to support their family in the 20s and 30s, and she did it by teaching school. And according to Nedra, she was a very good teacher, but she would only get 1-year contracts. So she'd be out in Shawmut for a year, and it would be this little one-room school, and then there'd be the teacherage, which is where the teacher was supposed to stay. But because she had these 5 kids, one ended up not living with her, but she had these 5 kids, they couldn't all fit in the teacherage. So she would have some of them sleep in the schoolhouse, which meant that she had to heat both the schoolhouse and the teacherage at night, which meant that she went through her coal allowance too fast, and the school board would get mad at her for spending too much money on coal, and they wouldn't rehire her the next year, so she'd go to a different one-room school. And they traveled all over Montana to these little one-room schools. But just the level of, you know, kind of penny pinching, you know, you're using too much coal, you know, and trying to keep these kids alive by teaching. It's fairly amazing. And then these prostitutes, you know, I think when we see prostitutes when people in movies, or when all those girls are dressing up as dance hall girls for vigilante days, they're not wearing this. You know, prostitutes didn't wear those tight corseted, really fancy clothes. They wore these Mother Hubbard outfits that were much more easy to get into. So that's what a prostitute dress is like. I wanted to spend the rest of my time, and hopefully people have questions too, but talking a little bit about this project that we're engaged in and showing off a little bit the work that we are doing. You know, as I think most of you know, it started, we started talking a couple years ago. In 1910, Washington State women get the right to vote. And Washington had a big party, and they had a conference, and a lot of Montana folks tripped over to Washington to go to their Women's History Conference that they were doing, and they put on they had a website, and they came back and they said, oh man, we got to do something cool, and we've got 4 years to plan it. So we started thinking about it in 2010. And we pretty soon decided that we wanted to you know, recognize the centennial, but we wanted to expand the story out beyond suffrage. That we felt like suffrage was too narrow for a lot of reasons. One reason is, although women win the right to vote in 1914, Indian women don't get the right to vote until 1924, because that's when the Indian Citizenship Act passes. You know, so if you were tribal, you know, I mean, if you renounced your tribal identity, then you could vote. But if you didn't, then you couldn't vote as an Indian person until 1924. And so we wanted to make sure whatever story we told was more inclusive than that 1914 story. And frankly, as I've kind of been pushing, I think politics is really important, but I think the way that there's so much more than politics, you know. And we wanted to tell that more inclusive story. And we've been working, frankly, I think really influenced by the whole, you know, Indian Education for All movement, in the schools and the way that we thought about it. And I had worked a lot with them through working on our textbook to kind of re-infuse our history, to broaden our historical lens, to be a more inclusive history, to make sure that we were including the voices and stories and perspectives of Indian peoples when we told Montana history. And I'd watched that work. I watched how it was different now, you know, in 2010, 2012, when we started really talking about this, than it was when I first came in 1995. You know, in 1995, the textbook still really had Indians relegated to, you know, before Lewis and Clark, there were Indians here, there were the Indian Wars, and then they went on reservations and they disappeared. And that was the Indian story that was told, right? And I watched over this period of time, that's no longer the Indian story that's told in school. It's no longer the Indian stories that we tell here. You know, if you walk through the Homeland, which is a good exhibit, but that kind of is how the Indian story is told, how it was told by historical societies and teachers and, you know, writers in the 80s when that exhibit was done. And then you walk through Neither Empty Nor Unknown, Montana at the time of Lewis and Clark, which is the big exhibit we did post Indian Ed for All, and you see it's a really different story. You know, we've really shifted that lens, and I thought, man, wouldn't that be cool if we could do that for women too? Wouldn't it be cool if we could really broaden? And what if we started telling women's stories as the central story as opposed to the peripheral story? How would that change the way that we saw history? And I don't know the answer to that question. I hope I'll know the answer to that question in 2015, after we put some of this effort into switching where we're standing and what stories we're telling and what stories we're looking at over the course of this year. So we knew we wanted to broaden it out. And we started working with a statewide committee of folks to come up with ideas to build this website. And this is what we ended up with. So on the main page, we have our blog. And I hope everyone will go and subscribe to the blog when you leave here. And then you'll get 2 to 3 emails a week with different stories that have to do with different aspects of women's history. And it'll be back to 1805, looking at women warriors all the way up to 2012, 2013. We chose 100 topics, 100 people, not all people, some of them are organizations, some of them are people, to kind of bring a really broad perspective. So these were the first 3, was prisoners, Pretty Shields, and Alma Snell, and that cultural preservation piece of passing down information, and suffrage. And then I guess we had the first 4. And then Evelyn Cameron and Julia Toole. So you can kind of see the diversity of the types of stories that will be shown on this blog. But that's not all. We are a research institution, so we put together bibliographies about women's history, looking at our research bibliographies from our manuscript collections, from our published collections, magazine articles, oral history collections, so that to encourage researchers to do more research. And the University of Montana is soon going to be adding bibliographies from their collection, their manuscript and oral history collection, so that'll be a treat. And then we decided we would put up all the articles that were ever published in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, on women, so that anyone can go and download them for free and read them. And so going all the way back to the 1850s, when things first started being published, we have over 130 articles that have been written. And it was really heartening, actually, to see how much had been written over the years, from coming from this perspective in a way that people hadn't been studying this and people hadn't been looking at this and people didn't know this. There's an arrogance to that kind of modern perspective, and then to go back and say, oh man, people have been writing and looking at these subjects for a really long time. And we actually have a wealth of information here to share with folks. So those are all there, so you should definitely spend some time. One of the things that we really want people to do is to go out and, like I said, history is what happens to all of us, and history, and we shape history every day by our actions or by our inaction, So we are living history right now, and the people that came before us, ordinary people, lived history too. And so to really encourage people to collect oral histories. That quote that I gave you from Jewel Peterson, that's posted on here. You can listen to her talk about love and marriage on the Homestead. You also, great little story about Betty's mom tells it like it is. She's talking about how she had this picture of a homestead. It looked really cute. And she put it in her living room. And her mom came in and she said, oh, let me tell you what, but you go in that door. She said, and there's a slop bucket that's just overflowing, waiting to be emptied, and there are the men's boots, and they're covered with manure, and so are the coats that are hanging up. There's pegs of coats that are just hanging up there, and they're covered with manure too, and the coal bucket's empty, and you got some sick kids, because you can't have the kids upstairs in the bedroom when they're sick. You can't be running up and down. You got them on the, you got them in their living room. You got a couple of sick kids there, and she said, it wasn't the good old days. And she said, you can have that picture up there, but I don't want to sit having to face it. I want. So, that's this great kind of perspective of real voices. Looking at the oral histories we've already collected, but then really encouraging people to go out, and we have, how-tos on how to conduct interviews and what you need to know. There's also this great statewide project DNRC has been doing, looking at women in agriculture, where they've been working through their conservation agents out in the field and interviewing women who are who are farmers, who are in who are the business end, who are farm wives, all sorts of different, and collecting oral histories about the farm experience for women. So that's a cool project that they're working on. We went around and we identified some places that were really significant or that were representative, even more than, is it going to click? Want to click? There we go. And we talked DNRC into giving us this cool map. Or, I'm sorry, CEIC, Census and Economic Information Center, made us this cool map. So you can click on the place, and that's the Conrad Mansion, and you can click there to learn more about Mrs. Conrad. You can click down here, and you can see it's the Holy Rosary Hospital. You can learn more about the Presentation Sisters. So, and they are really sort of representative of all sorts of different types of women's history. From Carolyn Lockhart, who was a Western writer. She wrote cowboy stories, to Where the Girl Saved Her Brother. She was a Northern Cheyenne woman, and they were at the Battle of the Rosebud, is how we call it, but the Cheyenne call it, where they call that battlefield, Where the Girl Saved Her Brother. She saw her brother's horse get shot down, and she rode into battle. She swooped him up behind her on her horse and rescued him. She also then fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. She's one of the only women that fought in both of those battles. So you can read about her. Church women, homesteading again, ranching, women's clubs, boarding houses. So just kind of a whole wide variety of sort of women's places are on that page. That's worth looking at. Where am I? Menu. Why is the menu going one way? I don't know. We'll go back. It doesn't want to do what I want it to do. It changed its perspective. Oh, I made it too big, I bet. That's why. There we go. Because it's interactive. We have curriculum resources. One thing, because it is a suffrage centennial, we did think it was worth putting on something about suffrage. And so, remember when I was talking about Hazel Hunkins, Kevin Koistra in Billings has done a lot of work on hers. There's a little movie about her. But one of the really fun things, I think, the project that the Historical Society has been involved in for a long time is the digitizing historic newspapers. So the Library of Congress and National Endowment for Humanities have been giving states grants to go and digitize historic newspapers, and we've been participating in that. One of the newspapers that we did digitize was the Suffrage Daily News. It was only a newspaper that was only 7 days long. They only had 7 days of it. And it was published during the state fair and then the day before Election Day. And here it is. So you can go back and read the actual newspapers, the propaganda organ of the suffrage movement. But you can also go back and look at, how suffrage was covered in other newspapers, like the Anaconda Standard, or the Montana News, which was a socialist paper out of Lewistown, or the Missoulian. So we went ahead and we looked for some of these articles to give you a sense of the time. And then, of course, you're going to end up reading the story next to it about the bank robber. Once you get into the historic newspapers, there's no escape. It's a rabbit hole. You can't. You're there for you're there for a long time. We really want every organization, every community group to do something to celebrate the centennial. We want to spread this all over the state of Montana. So as you think, and including Helena, as you think about the organizations that you're part of, think about what you can do to recognize the centennial and to kind of infuse women's history into our consciousness over the state. So we came up with a whole bunch of things, the ideas, everyone from honoring women today that have made a difference, registering to vote, of course, and going out and voting. We take it so much for granted. This year, November 3rd, November 3rd was the day that Montana men voted for women's suffrage, and that's the day that women got suffrage in 1914. That's the day before Election Day this year. So it's the Monday before Election Day. So everyone should go vote the next day in honor of their new right. Hosting a program, reading, preserving local cookbooks, visiting historic sites. There's a ton of different things. My personal favorite, is riding a bicycle. Susan B. Anthony said that bicycles did more to emancipate women than anything in the world. So lots of different ways to kind of, attend a sporting event, titled Girls Sporting Event in honor of Title IX. So lots and lots of different ways to kind of raise awareness and consciousness about women's history. So I hope that you'll spend some time on this website. I hope you'll subscribe to the blog. I hope you'll go back and share it with your friends. And I hope you'll plan events, and I hope if you do, you'll let us know about them so we can help you publicize them. And I'm happy to answer questions if people have them.